Her husband toasted her as his first wife in front of 50 guests. Vivian Clark, poised in midnight silk, didn't flinch. By sunrise, his signature sat beneath a clause that voided every shared asset. The foundation he built on her name was already dissolved. She'd spent 4 decades as his partner now. She was his verdict. And when he reached for what he once controlled, the prenup answered first. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The chandeliers glittered like they had something to prove. 50 of Asheville's finest lawyers, legacy families, old golf buddies, and garden club typecipped vintage Cabernet in Vivian Clark's vaulted dining hall. Waitstaff circled with canapés curated from a menu Vivian had personally approved, down to the rosemary garnish. The room was laughter, gold, and polite applause. It felt choreographed, until it wasn't. Graham stood at the head of the table, tapping his crystal glass with the tip of his fork. It rang out like a bell at the end of a sermon. People hushed. Vivian turned in her seat, instinctively folding her linen napkin on her lap, her posture effortlessly elegant in midnight blue silk. "My friends," Graham began, wearing that self-satisfied smirk he'd perfected in retirement. "Thank you for being here to celebrate 40 years of marriage to my first wife, Vivian Clark, the foundation." There was a pause, not silence, not gasps, just an awkward hiccup in the room's rhythm followed by nervous laughter. Too loud in pockets, too hesitant elsewhere. Like no one wanted to be the first to admit they didn't understand the joke, or worse, that they did. Vivian did not blink. She rose to her feet with a grace that had taken decades to cultivate, and made eye contact with precisely no one. "To Graham," she said, her voice even, carrying across the room like a glass of something too expensive to spill. "And to the comfort of shared history." She lifted her flute, smiled something polite and untouchable and took a single sip. Then she turned, murmured an excuse about needing air, and left the dining room with the kind of calm only a woman who had predicted this exact humiliation could muster. The hallway was darker, quieter, each step softened by antique rugs she'd chosen from catalogs while Graham was busy mentoring junior associates on the charity board. In the study, she closed the door without locking it and lit a single lamp by the leather armchair. Outside the window, the mountains stood impassive. Inside, she poured herself 2 fingers of the bourbon Graham kept for men's nights, the good bottle, from the hidden drawer behind the bookshelves. She didn't sit. Footsteps. She knew them before the knock. Max stood in the doorway, loose tie slung around his neck, expression tight with restraint. "He's crossed a line," he said. Vivian turned to face her son. "He's crossed it," she agreed, letting the amber in her glass catch the light. "But I laid it." Max's eyes flicked toward her bourbon, then the empty fireplace behind her. "Did you know he was going to say that?" Vivian smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I knew he was going to say something he couldn't take back." She moved to the far corner of the study and knelt in front of the fireproof cabinet embedded beneath the built-in shelves. It was a small vault, dull gray, disguised behind sliding cherrywood. Combination. Click. Open. She pulled out a single manila envelope, thick but flat, dated in her own handwriting. Prenup. Original signed copy. 1,985. Max exhaled. "I thought that thing was just a myth." Vivian stood and dusted off the corner of the envelope as if it were a family heirloom. "No, sweetheart," she said, slipping it under one arm like a clutch. "It's the foundation." She stepped past him and out into the hall, heels tapping with slow precision. In the background, another round of forced laughter rose from the dining room. The sound was sharp, this time edged with alcohol, entitlement, and the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. The morning light came in soft and undeserved. Vivian sat alone at the small breakfast table in the sunroom, where the walls were mostly windows, and the trees outside wore mist like silk robes. Her robe was slate gray, matching the calm she'd chosen. Her teacup sat untouched. The bourbon from the night before still lingered faintly on her tongue, sharper now. Her phone vibrated on the table. "Angela?" Vivian answered without a greeting. "It's real," Angela said. "No preamble. Signed, dated, witnessed, clause 14. B is still valid." Vivian pressed 2 fingers to her temple and let her eyes close for a beat. "Refresh my memory." Angela's voice stayed crisp, like cooled steel. If the husband engages in a sustained romantic or sexual relationship outside the marriage, verified by social or photographic evidence, his access to all jointly held assets is void. In shorts out. Vivian opened her eyes and looked toward the tall garden wall where climbing roses had started to falter in the heat. I need a certified copy. Quietly. Courier. Not mail. Use the same man you trust for estate documents. I'll have it in your hands before dinner, Angela replied. Vivian hung up and turned her phone face down. A breeze moved through the window screens, lifting a corner of yesterday's newspaper. She didn't touch it. Instead, she stood, walked to the built-in sideboard, and opened her personal ledger bound in soft black leather, unassuming and lethal. She turned to the last tab marked Family Holdings and made her first notation in nearly 8 years. Start review. Graham. Commingled accounts. Charitable trusts. Roth conversions. Upstairs, she could hear the faintest thump of movement. Graham. Alive. Unbothered. Probably whistling. Janet entered quietly from the service door, her arms full of folded linens and freshly pressed newspapers. Kitchen sending up something light, she said, keeping her eyes on the tray. Then she placed something else next to Vivian's cup, a single-page printout. Vivian looked down. It was a group photo last night's dinner. Celeste was front and center, standing too close to Graham, hand resting just behind his shoulder. Captioned, "Great night with future family. Number grateful." Vivian stared at the word future like it had stepped into her home wearing her perfume. Janet cleared her throat. She posted it around 3 a.m., deleted it an hour later. But the internet forgets nothing. Vivian folded the printout into thirds and tucked it into the ledger's back sleeve. "Thank you, Janet." Janet nodded and exited without a word more. Vivian returned to her notes, flipping to the beneficiaries tab. One by one, she reviewed each trust and account confirming where Max stood, where Graham had once been. Her pen hovered over several names, drawing clean, decisive lines through what no longer applied. She paused only once set to at a new name beside one property. Maxwell Clark Primary Inheritor. Asheville Residence. The sunroom was silent again, save for the scratch of pen on paper and the distant hum of someone else's plans beginning to fall apart. Max entered through the side patio, still in last night's suit pants, shirt open at the collar. He held a coffee mug he'd clearly made himself, and that small rebellion made Vivian's lip twitch in what almost passed for a smile. He looked at the photo on the tray, then at the ledger. "You're updating the whole thing?" Vivian didn't look up. "Started this morning." Max pulled out a chair and sat. "Do you want me to talk to him?" Vivian finally raised her eyes. "No," she said calmly. "This part is mine." Max nodded, once. He didn't push. "You already know what I'd say." Vivian's gaze flicked toward the hallway, where footsteps upstairs echoed again, Graham, moving as if he hadn't insulted the entire legacy of their marriage in front of 50 people. "Yes," she said. "You'd say he thinks this house is still his." Max raised an eyebrow. "And?" Vivian closed the ledger. "And by the time he notices the hinges missing, the doors will already be gone." Graham descended the stairs like a man entering applause. He still had last night's afterglow on his face rested, self-impressed, humming some Sinatra tune under his breath. Vivian heard him long before she saw him. His loafers creaked against the old hardwood floors, steady and entitled, pausing just long enough at the bottom step to check his reflection in the gold-framed mirror. Vivian was already seated at the breakfast table. Robe changed now deep, forest green, silk again, severe in its elegance. Her hair was twisted into a low knot. She didn't look up when he entered. "Morning," Graham said cheerfully, reaching for the coffee carafe like he hadn't rewritten her identity with a champagne toast. Vivian didn't respond. She only pushed a small silver tray across the table toward him. On it sat a single white rose. Beside it, an envelope, hand, addressed in her unmistakable script, his name, nothing else. Graham raised an eyebrow, amused. "Well, this feels theatrical." He slid the envelope open, unfolding the crisp cream stationery inside. His eyes scanned quickly then, slower. Prenup Acknowledgement of Original Terms. Section 14. B. Infidelity Clause. Acknowledgement of receipt and understanding. Signature required. Graham snorted, shaking his head as if she just handed him a poem from college. Dramatic, Viv. We were just celebrating. A joke, at best. Vivian looked up then, serene. Her voice was even, almost bored. So was I. You celebrated yourself. He leaned back in the chair and gave her the look he reserved for tax accountants and parking attendant shaft patients, half dismissal. You know I've never read that thing front to back. No one ever does. Vivian's tone didn't change. You did. You initialed every page. He picked up the pen resting on the tray and twirled it once in his fingers. You? Really think I'd walk away from everything over a dinner speech and a flirt? She said nothing. He stared at the document again, then smirked. You don't have a case. Vivian took a slow sip of her tea. Don't need one. The pen paused. Then, with a flourish only a man who'd once signed a yacht slip in Monaco would use, Graham scribbled his name. Bold, careless, confident. He dropped the pen like it was a mic, then reached for the newspaper beside him. Vivian reached for the signed page instead. No ceremony. No eye contact. Just a deliberate fold, and the faint rustle of parchment as she slid it into a neutral gray envelope pre-addressed, already sealed with Angela's private courier stamp. It disappeared into her lap beneath the table, where her hand rested with quiet finality. Across the room, Janet appeared in the doorway with a soft knock. The courier's here. Vivian didn't glance up. Tell him it's ready. Janet nodded, met Vivian's eyes, just long enough to offer a breath of solidarity, and disappeared. Graham didn't notice. He was chuckling now, unfolding the newspaper with a rustle of entitlement. Honestly, Viv, if I'd known this was your version of foreplay, I'd have toasted you twice. Vivian stood. He looked up, confused by her silence. She didn't respond, didn't flinch, just turned and walked out, her robe trailing like a quiet exodus behind her. The front door clicked shut moments later. Courier gone. Document gone. Options gone. Angela's office overlooked a quiet stretch of Montford, housed in a restored Victorian where every molding whispered old money. Inside, though, it was cold tech silent steel shelving, shadowless lighting, no clutter. Just digital heat and transactional truth. On her screen, Angela leaned closer to the spreadsheet. There it is, she murmured. Vivian didn't look up. She was seated in one of the leather guest chairs, her posture straight, her palms flat against a folder marked Restructure. Phase 1. Angela turned the monitor slightly. October last year. 75,000 transferred from Clark Family Holdings into a personal account under G. Clark Advisory, LLC. It wasn't declared during the 2023 Q4 reconciliation. Vivian exhaled, calm and measured, as if Angela had just confirmed rain for a garden she'd already watered. Perfect, she said softly, almost with affection. That activates Clause B. Angela's lips twitched upward in expression that, for her, was practically a laugh. Clause B. The one that triggered a mandatory redistribution of marital assets in the event of concealed financial misconduct by either party. Vivian had fought to keep it in the original prenup not because she mistrusted Graham then, but because she'd trusted his ambition more. Angela tapped a few keys. We'll start drafting the claim, and if we can prove intent to hide. We can, Vivian interrupted, finally looking up. He used the same LLC to expense a business class trip to Miami during the Foundation's gala last year. Said it was a speaking engagement. Angela nodded once, already halfway through a legal brief in her mind. We'll close the Foundation this week. He'll feel that. Vivian stood. Good. I'll open the new one under my maiden name. Same mission. No compromises. Angela handed her a slim thumb drive. Encrypted. All statements are updated as of this morning. The courier's on standby for signatures. Vivian left the office with a feeling she hadn't worn in years' agency, like pulling back the velvet curtain and remembering she owned the theater. And so, back at the Clark estate, the staff were preparing for the weekly luncheon, the kind of ritual Graham clung to as proof of continuity. In her study, Vivian opened a browser window and clicked Terminate on the shared Clark Family Foundation account. A dialog box asked, Are you sure? She didn't blink before clicking Yes. In another tab, she opened the new Foundation's account under the name V.J. Everly Truster. Original initials, the ones that existed long before she married Graham. She was done using his. And so, across town, Max sat in his office at the design firm, reviewing a client rendering when his phone buzzed. Celeste. He hadn't saved her number, but he recognized the overly breezy preview of the text. "Your father and I are starting something exciting." He stared at it for a long moment, then typed back, "You'll want to delete that. No punctuation, no anger, just fact." He dropped the phone onto the desk like it was hot and walked out to take a breath in the hallway. And so, back at the estate, Vivian reviewed the last of the revised investment portfolio's remapping mutuals and converting anything co-owned into a split trust with defined ownership. The finer moves would take weeks, but the framework was done. The boundaries were drawn. Janet entered quietly, holding 2 thick manila envelopes. "From Angela." Vivian opened the first and smiled. Inside was a single transaction log, neatly tabulated. The Miami trip, flagged and highlighted. Graham's LLC listed as the payee. Vivian picked up a pen and signed the bottom corner, sharp and unflinching. Janet tilted her head. "That good?" Vivian closed the folder and set it aside. "That legal?" "Oh." The morning air smelled of cut grass and quiet tension. Graham stood near the foyer mirror, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, rehearsing charm in the glass. His overnight duffel rested at his feet, monogrammed, casual in a way that signaled luxury without apology. The moment held an odd cheerfulness, as if nothing in their life had shifted. As if the white rose, the signed acknowledgement, the courier's departure had been part of some elaborate domestic game. "I'll be back Sunday," he announced, zipping the bag and reaching for his sunglasses. "Heading to the lake house with the guys. Couple cigars, bad poker, more bourbon than our doctors would allow." Vivian stood by the entry table, neither smiling nor frowning, just watching him like a woman watching weather pass through a distant county. "Sounds restorative." He gave her a playful wink. "You sure you won't miss me?" She met his gaze without resistance. "I'm sure you'll believe I did." That earned her a crooked grin, the kind he used when he thought he still had the upper hand. With a careless wave and the subtle arrogance of someone who assumed loyalty was permanent, Graham walked out the front door and disappeared into the summer morning. Vivian did not move until she heard the second gate click shut behind him. Only then did she reach for her handbag already packed, and waiting in the study and walk with even steps toward the waiting car. Oh, the Hollow Oak was the kind of place where nothing noisy ever happened. No birthday candles, no televisions, no music overhead, just polished wood, natural light, and the kind of deep booth seating that encouraged legal confidentiality. Angela was already seated, one hand resting on a folder so thick and orderly it looked military. "I've pre-flagged the key pages," Angela said without waiting for pleasantries. Her voice was steady, no more formal than usual, but not less either. She understood that this lunch wasn't for comfort. It was for conclusion. Vivian slid into the booth, her movements unhurried. She glanced at the folder but didn't open it yet. "Does he have any idea?" she asked, unfolding her napkin and setting it gently on her lap. Angela lifted her water glass. "If he did, he'd be on a call with a litigator right now instead of packing bourbon and excuses." Vivian gave a slight nod, the smallest acknowledgement of the long game satisfaction. "He always thought his charm was its own immunity clause." Angela leaned forward and opened the folder. "As of noon today, the breach filing is complete. Asset division is initiated. The prenup is now enforceable under full terms. Clause 14, B and Clause both activated." Vivian turned a page and skimmed the asset tables. The language was clean, surgical. Graham's name appeared only in reference to its removal. "He's locked out of the main accounts," Angela continued. "We're moving all philanthropic assets into the VJ Everly Trust, which is now recognized by the state. Max is listed as the successor trustee. There's nothing left for Graham to contest that won't drag his personal finances and private correspondence into open court." Vivian's eyes stopped on the last page, where her new will had been notarized and filed. "Good," she said softly. "Let the record show I didn't close the door." He simply didn't read the sign. Angela handed her a smaller envelope across the table. "His official exclusion from survivorship status has been submitted to the estate registrar. No more access, no automatic inheritance. He would have to sue and subpoena every document to try. That's unlikely." Vivian tucked the envelope into her bag and closed the folder. Across the restaurant, someone uncorked a bottle of wine. The small pop echoed softly beneath the hush of linen-covered lunch meetings and whispered contracts. Vivian glanced toward the window, sunlight hitting her rings, the ones she had bought for herself long before she was ever Mrs. Clark. Oh. Later that evening, back at the house, Janet entered the dressing room carrying 2 stacked trays lined with velvet and memory. The jewelry drawers were already open. "Shall I begin setting aside the estate pieces?" she asked. Vivian stood beside the window, arms crossed loosely. "Only the originals," she said after a moment. "The rest were gifts." Janet began sorting through the rows, lifting only the heirlooms and purchases she remembered Vivian selecting herself before the cruise necklaces, before the anniversary diamonds, before everything started needing to look expensive to feel real. "What do we do with the rest?" Janet asked gently. Vivian's voice was calm. "We leave them. They belong to the version of me that tolerated being bought." Oh. That night, Angela sent a single-line text, the kind only lawyers know how to deliver with gravity. Filed. Full enforcement begins at 11 a.m. Vivian looked at the message, then back at the ledger resting on her lap. She closed it, slowly. By Wednesday afternoon, the circles that once revolved around the Clarks had begun to tilt. Not publicly, not yet, but with the quiet, decisive precision that defined their kind. An invitation rescinded here. A garden club group chat falling curiously silent there. Women Vivian had smiled beside for decades now paused longer on her Instagram posts. Their likes were quieter, but more deliberate. A subtle nod in a town that didn't shout. Vivian hadn't made an announcement. She didn't need to. Asheville's old money air carried whispers like pollen drifting, landing, germinating in conversations over pimento cheese and linen-draped tables. It was Eleanor Dyer, the hostess of one of their longest-standing social luncheons, who said it aloud first. "She's going through with it." The words fell like a polished silver fork onto fine sheen noticeable, but not messy. Several women exchanged glances but said nothing. Not in judgment, in reverence. As if they had each, in their own quiet moments, wondered what it would take to do the same. I'm so. Across town, in a cluttered office with blinds drawn too tightly for daylight, Graham stood gripping his cell phone in one hand and pacing in slow, angry circles. The lake weekend had ended abruptly. No one had said why exactly, but the energy had shifted. The joking felt forced. The cigars were stubbed out early. One friend had even left after the first night, citing family stuff, but not elaborating. Graham had made 4 calls since breakfast. 3 went unanswered. The 4th was picked up by his older brother, Frank, who always answered even when he shouldn't. "She's cutting me out," Graham said before Frank could say hello. "You wouldn't believe what she's doing." Frank was silent on the other end for a beat too long. "She can't do this," Graham insisted, like the force of his voice might reverse legality. "She already did," Frank replied, tone flat as a legal pad. "And I hear she did it clean." Graham blinked. "What do you mean you hear?" But Frank had already disconnected. Not angrily, just finally. I'm so. Back in Asheville, Celeste sat alone on her sectional couch in a condo she didn't own, sipping rosé that had begun to taste acidic. She scrolled through her phone's low. Nervous scrolling, the kind you do when you're looking for good news that won't come. Her group chat had gone from emoji-heavy gossip to nothing, silence. One woman had even left the chat completely. Another had replied to her brunch invite with a vague, "busy month." Then came the line that froze her thumb mid-scroll. "You don't want to be a side note in court." It wasn't cruel, just surgical. The phone slid out of her hand and landed gently on the couch cushion beside her. The silence in the room suddenly felt personal. I'm so. Vivian attended Eleanor's luncheon that Saturday, arriving precisely 7 minutes late, the kind of lateness that makes people turn their heads but not check their watches. She wore a cream-colored blouse tucked into wide-legged navy trousers, her hair pulled back, not out of obligation but out of focus. She didn't dress to be noticed. She dressed like someone who'd stopped asking for permission. As she entered the room, the conversation dipped, then recovered but with an altered shape. No one gushed. No one pitied. Instead, heads nodded with quiet recognition. One woman stood when Vivian approached her seat. Another passed the vinaigrette without being asked. The performance of politeness had melted, and what remained was respect not loud, but undeniable. Vivian sat, folded her napkin in her lap, and offered nothing about Graham. She spoke about the foundation relaunch, her mother's pearls, a new book on fiduciary law. But every woman at the table knew what had truly been filed that week. I'm so. Later that evening, Vivian returned home to find Max in the study, legs stretched out on the leather ottoman, his phone in one hand, his laptop open but idle. He tried to call again, Max said without looking up. Twice. Vivian walked to the window, her reflection layered over the view of the garden. Did you answer? Max finally looked over. No, he said, setting the phone down. I didn't. She nodded. Not in approval, just acknowledgement. It was enough. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Outside, the wind picked up. One of the rose vines swayed against the trellis, its tendrils tugging gently at the structure that held it up. I'm so's. The first box was labeled Guest Wing, Master Set. Janet placed it carefully in the corner of the spare bedroom, wiping the dust from the cedar floorboards with a cloth before setting the next one down. She worked quietly, methodically, like a woman who'd folded this house in on itself once before and suspected she might again someday. Vivian stood near the west-facing window, sleeves rolled above her wrists, watching the early autumn sunlight bleed across the mountain ridges. This room bright, distant from the main suite, quieter than Graham had ever tolerated, had once been used for visiting relatives and old friends who preferred longer stays. Now, it would be hers. I've gone ahead and moved the safes, Janet said, nudging the box into alignment with the others. The real jewelry's already secured off-site. Just photographs, papers, a few books left to bring over. Vivian nodded but didn't turn around. Move the ledger last, and make sure the contents of the desk drawer go with it, nothing left behind, even if it looks useless. Yes, ma'am. Downstairs, a door shut harder than necessary. Vivian didn't flinch. She waited until the sound of Graham's loafers moved from the entryway to the hall before she stepped into the corridor. He found her halfway to the back stairs. His voice had that mock-casual edge she'd known since his law school days, the one he used to close gaps too wide for sincerity to span. We can fix this, he said, hands half in his pockets like a man offering détente instead of apology. You're upset. You've made a statement. Okay. But let's not burn the house down over one bad party and a misread moment. Vivian stopped walking, not because he'd asked her to, but because it was her house and she didn't need to retreat. She turned to face him. We're well past drywall and paint. He stared at her, trying to decode what she meant, as if charm might still be enough, as if words, said in the right tone, could undo a legal structure already cemented beneath his feet. She walked past him without another word. He followed, footsteps slower now, the air between them thick with realization. That afternoon, a technician from a private firm arrived in an unmarked van. He was in and out within 40 minutes. By sundown, every access code on the property had been changed. The main gates, the garage, the guest wing, even the climate control system. Graham wouldn't notice until it was inconvenient. Which was the point. Janet resumed her sorting just after dinner. This time, she brought out the black ledger, the original, and placed it into the bottom drawer of the newly arranged study, just adjacent to Vivian's room. She glanced at a tray of framed photo sweatings, holidays, Graham's proud golf trophy sand. With unspoken permission, began wrapping those, too. You don't have to pack the memories, Vivian said gently, entering the room with a fresh set of printouts. Janet didn't look up. These aren't memories, ma'am. They're liabilities. Vivian offered a tight smile, one hand resting lightly on the desk. Fair enough. Later that evening, as Vivian skimmed new balance sheets Angela had sent over, her email pinged with a subject line that stopped her mid-sip of tea. Some clarification. From Celeste, Belle, at... The message opened with an insufferably cheerful greeting. Vivian, I just wanted to reach out woman to woman. It went on for 3 paragraphs. Something about feelings being complicated. Something about Graham deserving to feel seen. And then, just beneath the gloss a sentence Vivian could almost predict. I'm not trying to come between what you two built. I just see how happy he is now. Vivian read it once, closed the tab, and blocked the address without replying. Some things were beneath response. Others were already being addressed in legally binding language. Downstairs, Graham was pouring himself a drink and muttering to himself. He hadn't seen the technician. He hadn't noticed the photos gone from the hallway. He still thought he was negotiating from a position that existed last week. He yelled toward the stairs, voice strained with casual venom. "I don't need your money, Vivian." She was halfway into her closet, folding winter scarves into linen-lined drawers when she replied without raising her voice. "You've certainly borrowed it." Eh? Graham's version of events arrived first in whispers. It began with a breakfast at the club, his voice pitched louder than necessary over eggs he barely touched. A few members leaned in out of curiosity, not support. He talked of overreactions, misunderstandings, how a good woman his wife had been manipulated by old resentments and high-priced legal theater. "She's confused," he told someone who had once toasted their anniversary with vintage Bordeaux. "She's angry. I can give her time." But what came through wasn't assurance. It was desperation, lacquered in confidence, and handed out like party favors. Every word he offered about Vivian had too many qualifiers, too much protest, like a man who'd practiced denial in the mirror and still couldn't get it to land right. By the time lunch was over, no one was asking him for details. They were asking each other if he had started drinking before noon. Angela's office had already prepared for this. Vivian hadn't asked her to send anything, not directly. But Angela had seen this pattern before. Men reaching for the narrative like it was theirs by birthright. And the best answer to spin was fact. Within 48 hours, she had drafted and filed a brief that would quietly circulate among attorneys, estate agents, and advisory boards. Nothing dramatic. No names named in public. Just an outlined breach, supported by transactional timelines, notarized documents, and the prenup clauses Graham had signed, reread, and signed again. It was a paper wall elegant, high, and indisputable. Angela emailed Vivian a copy and offered a spare line of commentary. "He'll choke on his own version before anyone else swallows it." Vivian responded with a single word. "Filed." Alder. A columnist from the local paper reached out the next day, her tone warm and conspiratorial. She left a voicemail referencing sources and sensitive but celebratory circumstances. Vivian deleted the message without playing it a second time. She had no interest in public performances. Silence, once a survival tool, had become strategy. Alder. Max, however, moved differently. He made no announcements, no phone calls. Just quiet conversations in back patios and small family dinners, where old friends and distant cousins were beginning to ask questions. He didn't offer drama, only details. Not gossip, but fact. He signed a clause. Max told his cousin Joanna over lunch. Then he triggered it. Everything that's happening, he invited it in. Joanna didn't say anything for a moment. She just nodded and reached for the check, without letting Max see the look on her face. She'd once told Graham he reminded her of her father. Now she saw that wasn't a compliment. Alder. 3 days later, Vivian returned from her foundation board meeting to find a long white box sitting on the bench near the mudroom. Janet had already removed the card and placed it neatly on the entryway table. It was cream-colored and heavy stock, the kind you only find in university gift shops or at paper stores run by women who still write in fountain pen. The handwriting was unmistakable. 3 names, all college friends. Women who had once shared late-night coffee and Latin flashcards, who had each sent wedding gifts with embossed return labels and good intentions. Inside the box, a simple bouquet of white lilies. The note read, "You were always the smart one. We're just sorry it took him this long to find out." Vivian placed the note inside the bottom drawer of her new desk. She left the flowers in water, untouched. Alder. That evening, Graham's attorney, a man who'd once flirted with Vivian at a holiday partisan, an email requesting informal mediation, a chance to resolve things without escalating unnecessary tension. Angela forwarded it with a blinking cursor waiting below. "Would you like to reply, or should I decline on your behalf?" Vivian replied without ceremony. "Decline." Without response. Alder. Later, as the sun set over the back garden, Vivian stood near the kitchen windows, sipping chilled white wine as Janet loaded the last of the heirloom china into the pantry drawers. Neither woman spoke. The sound of the cabinet's closing was steady, final. In the distance, the gate buzzer rang gaunts, sharply. Janet looked up. Vivian didn't flinch. "Let it ring." They both knew he didn't have the code anymore. The email came just before noon. A flagged message from Angela's office with no subject line, only an attachment named Celeste, Transfer Notice, PDF. Vivian opened it on her iPad while seated in the sunroom, her tea untouched. The page loaded slowly, the server lagging under encrypted strain. When it appeared, it was almost elegant in its simplicity: 2 columns, one line highlighted in yellow. A transfer from G. Clark Advisory LLC to an account registered under Celeste Bell's name. The amount, $212,000, withdrawn in 2 installments, both dated the week prior. Angela's note followed seconds later. She took everything and didn't look back. Vivian placed the iPad on the glass table beside her, exhaled slowly, and stared out at the mountain lineate's ancient, stoic shape, a silent affirmation. She did not smile, but her chest lifted with a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years, not because it was over, but because now Graham would finally understand the weight of what he had built in arrogance, not bedrock. Alder. Angela's voice on the call was clipped, efficient. We've already filed a freeze order on Graham's remaining private account's personal business, even the unregistered trust he used for the Florida properties. The court won't challenge it with the evidence we submitted last month. Vivian sat at her writing desk, a fountain pen in one hand, her estate ledger opened to a nearly full page. Do it, she said softly. I want the locks changed on his liquid assets the same way I changed them on the gates. Angela hesitated. You understand this will be a rupture point. He won't call a lawyer this time, he'll call you. I know. Vivian closed the ledger and set the pen aside. The money was never the thing. It's the mirror he can't survive. The call came just after sunset. She answered on the 3rd ring. You destroyed me! Graham's voice was jagged with panic. The false composure from weeks ago now completely shed. Vivian didn't raise her voice. Number? You did that when you renamed me mid-toast. This is just cleanup. You think this is justice? He hissed. You think this makes you noble? I don't need to be noble, she said calmly. I just need to be precise. There was silence on the line, but she could still hear him breathing unsteady, uncomposed. You're going to regret this, he said finally. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a man hoping she might still believe he had something left to take. Vivian ended the call without another word. Her hand didn't even shake. Angela moved fast. Within 24 hours, the estate paperwork had been refiled. Vivian's survivorship plan no longer included Graham in any capacity, no medical directives, no retirement transfers, no stake in her charitable holdings. Angela's team submitted the addendum to the registrar with a timestamp and a notary seal. It was the last document necessary to make Graham legally non-existent in her future. Max found out from Angela first, then stopped by the house to check in. He brought lunch from their favorite Italian place downtown, still warm, the paper bags crinkling with sauce and garlic. As they sat in the guest wing's reading nook, the afternoon sun pooling across the floor, Max broke the silence. He's got less than he started with, he said. She took the LLC account. The rest is frozen, and with the tax penalty, she's underwater. Vivian stirred her iced tea, then looked up slowly. Was there ever a version where he didn't end up here? Max thought for a moment, then shook his head. Maybe, but it wouldn't have included Celeste, or the toast. Vivian gave a soft exhale. Not laughter, not relief, just a sound that released a weight without giving it dignity. That evening, as Janet secured the last few boxes in the upstairs storage alcove, she returned to the kitchen holding a small silver frame. A photograph of Graham and Celeste at some Galathon where Celeste had worn red and Graham had refused to call it a date. Do you want this packed or tossed? She asked, holding it up with gloved fingers. Vivian didn't look. Neither. Leave it. Leave it where? Vivian finally turned from the sink. Somewhere he'll see it when he realizes she's gone. Janet nodded once and placed it in the vestibule drawer, the one Graham still thought held spare keys. The dining room had been reset, not staged, not decorated, but restored. Gone were the linen runners and towering floral centerpieces of anniversaries past. Tonight's table was narrower, more intimate, polished walnut, with low candles flickering at either end. The silver was inherited, not engraved. The china was old but familiar. Vivian had chosen every dish: herself saffron risotto, roasted fennel, fig-glazed duckand, made sure the wine was poured into crystal that predated Graham entirely. She hadn't wanted a celebration, only a gathering. Just 6 people had been invited. Eleanor, Angela, 2 women from the foundation board, Max and Janet, though the latter had insisted on serving, not sitting. "I'll join you for dessert," Janet had said that morning, rolling out pastry dough with an ease that masked its precision. "That way I don't have to pretend to enjoy Eleanor's politics." Vivian had laughed softly, the way people laugh when they finally mean it. Now, seated at the head of her own table, Vivian wore a navy sheath dress and a string of pearls that once belonged to her mother. Her posture was unforced, her presence unguarded. This was not a woman keeping up appearances. This was a woman living in her own name again. The meal unfolded gently. Conversation was fluid, punctuated by memory and quiet admiration. Max sat at her right, watchful but relaxed, passing plates and anecdotes with a kind of reverence he no longer had to disguise. When the dessert fig tarts with almond cream was set before them, Janet finally pulled up the last chair. She placed her napkin on her lap with care and took a long sip of the port Angela had brought. Then Max stood. He didn't raise his glass right away. He let the silence settle. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear but low, meant for the room and no one outside of it. "To the woman," he began, "who never needed a second name to matter." Vivian didn't blink. She didn't tear up. She just looked at her son, as if seeing him all over again, not as a child or as a defender, but as a man who had quietly chosen sides and never once switched them. The room raised their glasses, and no one clinked. They didn't need to. The next morning, Janet entered the former home office with a bucket, gloves, and a quiet sense of satisfaction. The room had been left untouched for nearly 2 weeks, save for the occasional pass-through when Angela's courier had collected Graham's final documents. Now, the framed law certificates had been taken down. The mahogany desk had already been claimed by the auction house. The rug, once a boastful Persian Graham claimed was a deal, had been rolled and tied, set near the front door for donation. As Janet moved through the space with the vacuum, she hummed softly. Vivian appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, watching for a moment. "Feels good to vacuum out lies," Janet said, her hand steady on the handle. Vivian smiled. Fresh rugs, fresh legacy. IT. Later that week, Angela accompanied Vivian to the Regional Grant Council, where Vivian formally opened the E.J. Everly Scholarship Fund, named after her mother. It would provide financial aid to women returning to higher education after age 35, women who, like Vivian once had, knew the weight of obligation before the freedom of choice. The paperwork was signed without ceremony, just a quiet tap of pen to paper, a fund born not out of rage, but realignment. Angela handed her the final certificate. "It's done." Vivian held it for a moment, then placed it gently in her bag. "We build better when we name it ourselves." IT. That evening, in the emptiness of what used to be Graham's office, Janet swept the baseboards and found a small cufflink beneath the radiator gold, with engraved initials he'd once insisted she polish weekly. She held it for a beat, then placed it silently on the mantel. When Vivian walked in minutes later, she noticed it, but she didn't touch it. Instead, she turned to the window, looked out over the lawn, and watched the last of the magnolia petals fall into the grass. IT. The ruling arrived mid-morning by certified mail, though Angela had already forwarded the decision via encrypted PDF the night before. Still, Vivian took the envelope in her hands and held it for a moment, before opening either thumb, tracing the seal as if feeling the temperature of a verdict. She stood in the sunlit entryway, envelope in one hand, untouched coffee cooling on the console beside her. The house was silent, except for the quiet tick of the antique clock near the stairs. Graham had once insisted on restoring it to working condition, but now it marked time in her name alone. She opened the envelope cleanly, unfolded the pages, and read the ruling Tuisano because she didn't believe it, but because she wanted to feel every word. The court affirms the enforceability of the prenuptial agreement dated May 6, 1985. Finds the respondent, Graham E. Clark, In material breach of Clause 14b and Clause b, full sole ownership of the following assets shall remain with the petitioner, Vivian J. Everly Clark, as defined in Exhibit A. The list of properties, accounts, and holdings filled 2 pages. The house, the lake lot, the brokerage account he'd used to cover Celeste's wine habit. Even the condo in Charleston he thought she didn't know about. It was all hers now. But Vivian didn't smile. There was nothing performative about the win. It was not triumph, it was restoration. She folded the papers and slid them into her ledger. And then she made her coffee again. This time, she drank it hot. IT. Graham's outrage went public the next day, as she'd expected. At first, it was phone calls to old law school friends, to former colleagues on the foundation board, to men who had once clinked glasses with him over rare steaks and laughed at his stories about Viv being the brains of the operation. But the calls didn't land the way they used to. Responses came slower, less eager. Excuses multiplied. Some offered polite silence. Others gave a single damning word. "Graham," one had said flatly, "I read the filings. She gave you more than you deserved." Then came the posts. On a Sunday afternoon, he published a scathing Facebook rant that began with a quote-something pseudo-legal and vaguely misogynistic and spiraled into half-coherent accusations about betrayal, entrapment, and the weaponization of loyalty. He tagged no one, but the post was clear in its target. Several comments appeared in the first hour or two in solidarity, 5 in disbelief, and one from an old neighbor that simply read, "You should have stayed quiet, Graham." The post was reported and removed before midnight. He reposted the next morning. That one didn't survive the hour. IT. Vivian didn't comment. She didn't react. But Max, seated on the porch beside her one evening with a bourbon and a familiar weariness in his voice, brought it up anyway. "He's going to move in with someone else," he said. "You know that, right? It won't last, but he'll try. He needs to feel chosen." Vivian kept her eyes on the horizon, where the last of the daylight was caught between mountain folds. "I'm not watching the sequel." Max smirked but didn't press. He understood. She wasn't bitter. She was finished. IT. That week, Janet boxed up the last remnants of what had once been Graham's presence in the house, a faded tennis visor, a framed quote about winning the long game, a pair of Scotch glasses etched with his initials. She packed them into a discreet box, labeled simply "Outbound." "No forwarding address?" she asked. Vivian looked up from the kitchen counter, where she was organizing paperwork for the scholarship fund's fall recipients. "No," she said quietly. "That part of the map's been erased." Janet nodded, then carried the box to the garage. She left it near the side door, the same one Graham had once used to sneak in after long lunches that weren't just lunches. Okay. Later that night, Vivian received a brief text from Angela. "All account transfers finalized. Your estate is fully secured. Nothing traceable." She replied simply, "Thank you. Let's keep it clean through the end." Okay. The reservation had been made under a different name, E.J. Everlinot, out of secrecy, but to set the tone. No Clark. No baggage. Just initials she hadn't seen on a table card in over 40 years, and a name that now belonged solely to her again. The restaurant sat at the edge of Biltmore Village, tucked between an art gallery and a wine shop with hand-painted signage. The kind of place people didn't rush through. There were no televisions on the walls, no music competing with the conversation. Just candlelight and a low murmur of voices, steady as breath. Vivian arrived precisely at 7. The host, a young woman with dark lipstick and a practiced calm, led her to a table in the corner private, away from the windows. He was already seated. David Harrow, college debate team, journalism major, wore cardigans when everyone else wore protest slogans. They had shared 3 semesters of mutual infatuation and one painful parting. He had gone north, chasing publishing. She had stayed south, chasing a life that promised permanence. Now, older, his hair silvered at the temples, his expression thoughtful, David stood when she approached, pulling her chair out with the kind of ease that didn't perform chivalry, it simply understood it. "Vivian Everly," he said with quiet warmth. "You haven't changed. You've just sharpened." She smiled genuinely this time. "You remembered the name. I never forgot it." Okay. Dinner moved slowly. like a well-written essay. They spoke of books, mostly what they'd read, what they regretted not writing. She told him about the foundation. He told her about his time teaching journalism at a liberal arts college in Vermont. Neither mentioned failed marriages. Neither asked about the other's loneliness. The conversation was spacious, free of performance or pressure. They didn't flirt. They reflected. "There's something rare," he said, midway through a glass of Sancerre, "about getting to see someone survive their story and then rewrite it." Vivian tilted her head. "It's not rewritten," she said. "It's footnoted properly." He smiled. "To the smartest woman in the room, then." He raised his glass. She clinked hers to it just once. It echoed softly against the brick wall. Okay. By 9:30, they were saying goodbye at the curb. No promises, no dramatics, just a single, deliberate exchange of warmth. "If you're ever in Vermont," he said, holding her gaze for a respectful moment. She nodded. "And if you're ever in Asheville, come see what I've built." Okay. Vivian arrived home to a house that no longer creaked beneath unspoken tension. Janet had left the hallway lights on and a tray in the kitchen ginger tea, lemon wedges, a small plate of almond cookies. As she slipped off her heels and hung her coat, Janet walked in from the mudroom, wiping her hands on a linen towel. "Good dinner?" Vivian nodded. "It was clean." "Clean's underrated," Janet replied, setting the towel aside. "And rare." She poured tea for both of them and sat at the kitchen island, uninvited but always welcome. "You ever think about teaching?" Janet asked after a pause. "Everything you've learned, survived, filed. You could build a school, Viv. Not just for women, hell, for anyone who doesn't know what silence can actually do." Vivian smiled softly, stirring her tea. "Maybe someday." Janet leaned back, sipping. "I'd enroll. With honors." The house settled around them, warm and calm, like an exhale. Okay. Later, as Vivian walked through the hallway toward the guest wing, she passed the door to Graham's old study, now empty, clean, and quiet. A single beam of moonlight stretched across the cast floorboards, in long, angled shadows that no longer belonged to memory. She paused briefly in the doorway, then continued on without looking back. Okay. The pen was heavier than it looked, platinum-bodied with a deep navy lacquer finish. It had been a gift from Angela, given without ceremony but with perfect timing. Vivian had left it on her desk for 3 days, untouched, letting the weight of what it would do settle around it. This morning, she finally picked it up. The final estate document waited on her desk beneath a white linen blotter. No ribbon, no legal flourish. Just the plain, extraordinary truth of it printed in 12-point serif. Revised Living Trust Agreement of Vivian J. Everly. She scanned the lines again slowly, deliberately. Every asset listed, every clause reviewed. Her signature would finalize what months of meticulous silence had built. Ownership of all current and future holdings transferred solely to her and, upon her death, to Max. There were no alternate beneficiaries, no charitable riders that could be manipulated, and no footnotes bearing Graham's name. At the bottom of the page, a line waited for ink. Vivian clicked the pen and signed. Her handwriting was fluid, unrushed. It didn't shake. She dated the page and slid it into the manila folder Angela had left that morning, marked Final Private Copy. As she pressed the flap closed, something inside her settled with it. A boundary made permanent. Ida 1. Max arrived an hour later. She met him in the vestibule, where he stood in worn jeans and a gray sweater, holding a coffee he hadn't finished, and a smile that didn't mask the emotion behind it. "It's done?" he asked, stepping inside. Vivian nodded. "Completely." He pulled her into a hug-tight and lasting and didn't speak until he stepped back. "I watched you carry this house with your spine," he said, quiet and reverent. "You don't have to do that anymore." Vivian didn't reply. She just touched his cheek and walked him toward the study. Ida 1. Angela arrived at noon, hair pulled back, blazer tailored with precision. She didn't linger, didn't distract. She handed Vivian a sealed envelope with the certified copies and a second, thinner folder containing a summary sheet for legal record. "He underestimated your silence," she said as Vivian flipped through the contents. Vivian gave a soft, amused hum. "Most people do." Angela placed a discreet black folio on the credenza behind the desk. "I had the prenup scanned, archived, and mounted. 1 copy for storage, 1 for framing. It's been notarized as a matter of historical interest, not for sentiment. Vivian raised an eyebrow. Angela clarified. He made it your cage. You made it your key. Ida won. Later that evening, Janet helped her reorganize the household safe. It had once been Graham's domain, cluttered with unnecessary papers, worthless coins, and receipts from dinners he'd written off as business. Now it housed 3 items: the new deed, the trust ledger, and a notarized copy of the estate plan bearing only her name. Vivian tucked each document into its fireproof sleeve with quiet precision. When she was finished, Janet handed her the final framed item, Angela's clean-lined display of the original prenuptial agreement. The text was reduced, not decorative but legible, set behind museum-grade glass, and mounted in simple matte black. "Where should it go?" Janet asked, holding it gently at her waist. Vivian didn't hesitate. "Not the wall." She gestured to a built-in cabinet near her reading nook, the one Graham never used. Janet slid it onto the top shelf and closed the doors. They stood in silence for a moment, the air in the room weightless. Then Vivian smiled. "Let's change the locks on that cabinet, too." Janet laughed. "Already done." Ida won. That night, Vivian stepped outside onto the back terrace. The moon was high, the magnolia trees still shedding the last of their summer green. She walked barefoot to the edge of the flagstone, the air cool against her skin, the quiet no longer tense, but whole. Inside, her phone buzzed once on the entry table. Filing confirmed. Recorded and time-stamped. Irreversible. She didn't rush to check it. She knew what it said. She just watched the stars blink on, one by one. Ida won. The morning air felt different, not just cooler, but clearer, like something had been filtered from the walls overnight. Vivian walked slowly through the house, barefoot on the hardwood, a cup of mint tea warming her palms. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the scent of autumn leaves and cut grass. No voices echoed down the hallway. No shoes thudded against the foyer tile. It was quiet, not the brittle silence of tension, but the kind that holds after a long note finally fades. She paused in the formal living room. The mantel was clean now, no plaques, no trophies, no fake laurels of legacy. Just a single photograph. Her, Max, and Janet at the Foundation's relaunch ceremony. The rest of the frames had been packed and stored or donated. Only the ones that mattered had earned their place back. Max's voice came from the front staircase. "I brought the last box." Vivian turned as he entered, carrying a wooden crate wrapped in linen. Inside were the final photographs for the hallway wall portraits, candid shots, and black and white prints from the old days. He set the box down beside a small step stool and opened it carefully. "Want help hanging?" he asked. Vivian nodded. "Only if we start left to right. Survival first, sentiment second." He grinned. "That's your memoir title." Together, they began placing the frames. No symmetry, no rules, just people who had stayed. Eleanor, laughing into a champagne glass. Angela, unsmiling but grounded, arms folded at the gala. Janet in the kitchen caught mid-laugh, flour dusting her shoulder. And Max teenage, awkward, arms around Vivian's waist at the lake house years ago, before any of it cracked. When they stepped back, the wall didn't look decorated. It looked remembered. Oh, By afternoon, the final RSVPs had rolled in. Vivian had sent the invitation 2 weeks earlier, simple, elegant, free of pretense. It wasn't embossed. It wasn't catered. It read, "Join me for something new." No toasts, no speeches, just truth. Sunday at 4. Come as you are. E.J.E. There would be no string quartet, no rented glassware, no gift table or engraved napkins. Just food. Vivian cooked her self-roasted root vegetables, lemon chicken, a pear tart Max had helped her bake. The guest list was short, just 10 people. Every one of them had witnessed her storm and stayed anyway. The name on the event was hers, legally, publicly, proudly. Vivian stood by the kitchen window as the event live-streamed on the Foundation's homepage. A banner across the screen read, E.J. Everly Fund, Annual Gala, sponsored by Everly Futures. Not Clark, not affiliated, entirely hers. She didn't watch long just enough to see the young women speaking at the podium, poised and certain, their voices steady and unapologetic. Max walked in, 2 glasses of sparkling cider in hand. "They're standing for you," he said, nodding toward the screen. Vivian took a glass and sipped. "They're standing for themselves. Oh, die." Later that evening, the house filled slowly. The first knock came right at 4. Eleanor arrived with a box of handwritten poems, decades old. Angela brought lemon thyme and 2 bottles of good red. The others followed board members, friends, 2 young women from the scholarship program. No one overdressed, no one overperformed. They ate on mismatched plates. The chairs didn't match either. At one point, someone reached for a wine glass and paused. There was no clink, no signal, just a shared pause, as if waiting for something to be declared. Janet broke the silence from the kitchen door, drying her hands on a striped towel. "No one's clinking glasses at you tonight," she said. "They're standing." Vivian looked around the room's soft lamplight. Shared laughter. No polished lies. She nodded. "That's enough." O.D. Much later, after the guests had gone and the dishes were done, Janet found Vivian still seated in the sunroom, her fingers resting lightly on the arm of the chair. The tea beside her had gone cold. She wasn't tired, just still. Janet gestured toward the hallway. "You want me to unplug the porch lights?" Vivian shook her head, eyes still on the dark lawn beyond the glass. "Leave them on tonight." "For the guests?" Vivian's voice was quiet. "For the future." O.D. The porch was quiet that morning, wrapped in a pale blue mist that hadn't yet burned off from the hills. Vivian sat alone at the edge of the wicker love seat, a knitted shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders and a cup of black tea cooling in her hands. The scent of lemon balm drifted in from the garden. A small wooden tray rested beside her with 2 items, a fountain pen and a single check made out in her name, drawn from her private account. She'd already filled out the amount $100,000, earmarked for the new emergency housing grant under Everly Futures. All that remained was the signature. She signed it cleanly, then laid the pen down and pressed the check beneath a smooth glass paperweight. She didn't rush to mail it. That would come later. This moment was the final act of her choosing, not his undoing. Behind her, the door creaked open. Angela stepped out, holding her own tea, blazer folded over her arm like she'd already filed 3 motions that morning. Her voice was even. "All estate locks are confirmed. Everything routed and protected. There's nothing left he can touch." Vivian didn't respond right away. She just looked out across the lawn where the magnolias had shed their last bloom. "And the trust language?" Angela nodded. "Unchallengeable. Your name is the origin. And the terminus." Vivian smiled faintly. "Good. That means we've planted something." O.D. By late afternoon, the newspapers had already moved on. There was no follow-up op-ed, no commentary column. Celeste had vanished without statement or spectacle. Her social media accounts had gone dormant. Her last post a quote about the power of beginning again sat alone, unliked and unanswered. Graham's name appeared one final time in a quarterly financial digest, a bullet point reference to a forfeited position at a boutique advisory firm. No comment given. His phone number changed. His address went unlisted. The once loud stories told over club lunches and second whiskeys went quiet. Not because people forgot, but because no one cared to repeat them. Obscurity, Vivian had once heard, was the last punishment for men like him. Not exile, not scandal, just the loss of audience. End of eyes. That evening, she stepped into her study and opened the drawer Janet had once locked. Inside, nestled beside notarized deeds and cleanly stamped ledgers, was the framed Prenup Angela's precise, museum-grade copy. Vivian held it for a moment, feeling the cool weight of glass, then set it down and shut the drawer. Not with force, just certainty. End of eyes. Max arrived just before dinner, carrying fresh-cut bread and a bottle of pear balsamic they'd once ordered on a whim. He found her in the kitchen, slicing leeks for soup, humming quietly to herself. "You still feel like celebrating?" he asked, placing the bag on the counter. Vivian wiped her hands on a cloth and turned to face him. "Celebrating?" Max shrugged. "Closure. Vindication. Whatever it is when everything that needed ending actually ends." Vivian didn't answer right away. She moved across the kitchen to the drawer, the one now closed and locked, and placed her palm gently over it. Then she looked at her son, her voice soft but solid. He gave a toast, she said. I gave a verdict hand, closed the estate he thought was his.